primarily through bracket creep. And it does so with a number of things which I suggest are based on a somewhat crude and mechanistic view of the way that people behave, and a more sophisticated approach to policy might reveal that some of those things are probably going to be own goals in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And sort of, it sort of follows that theme in a sense from Ben, this notion of a whole series of incentives that actually then become disincentives. I liked your image of the patient at the beginning, and then as you went on, you said, oh, of course, under this scheme, the patient wouldn't actually turn up to go to the doctors. So, we've got to look at where are the contradictions in this? How do we start to tease that out? And what does it mean when, in fact, the system left to its own devices through bracket creep and other things actually seems to deliver more of the goal of the government? As you said, there are policy-owned goals involved here that actually mitigate against the solutions which are being proposed. So next up is Andrew Leigh, Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Federal Member for Fraser and a former Professor of Economics at ANU, and many of you will be familiar with his book, all about inequality in the history of Australia, on battlers and billionaires. So I look forward to Andrew having a big picture view of this as well as the political responses. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. Can I, of course, acknowledge for meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. To thank Mark and Roger and Michael, Inside Canberra, NATSEM and ANSOG for putting on a terrific event. My only quibble, of course, as an economist, is the breaching of the no free lunch principle, which we hold sacred, but we can discuss the downside of that later. I'm very pleased in particular to share the stage with Paul Porteous, with whom I studied for a little while on the other side of the world, Ben Phillips, who is a vital part of making sure that the public understands the distributional effects of policy and that great NATSEM legacy, and the two Grattans, the Grattan Institute, headed by John Daly, and Michelle Grattan, who is, of course, an institution in her own right, the doyen of the Press Gallery. It's a real honour to be here with all of you. In my view, we ought to assess Budget 2014 based on three simple principles. First of all, what does it do to the deficit? Secondly, has it kept faith with the Australian people? And thirdly, does it meet the fairness test? So let me go through each of those in turn. In terms of the impact of the budget on the deficit, I think many Australians would say, well, yes, there's been a contribution made to what the Treasurer would call budget repair. But the downside of that is what you're doing is comparing Joe 2014 with Joe 2013. The government brought down a budget update last year that doubled the deficit, and its every attempt since then has been to compare this budget with the budget update. That should have been ruled out in the late 1990s when Peter Costello brought out the Charter of Budget Honesty, which said that during the election period, the Secretaries of Treasury and Finance would bring down a pre-election economic and fiscal outlook, which would lay bare the state of the books and with which any later budget decisions could be compared. Compared with that independent assessment, what's striking about Budget 2014, hashtag Budget 2014, is that it has increased the deficit this year, it's increased the deficit next year, and it's increased the deficit over the forward estimates. This is a budget that increases the deficit compared to the way the budget was when the government took office. Now, there's a number of reasons that that's the case. Partly the government has said no to significant sources of revenue. These include the carbon price, which isn't just the most effective and efficient way of dealing with climate change, but is also accounting for somewhere between $12 and $20 billion of revenue over the forward estimates. There's the mining tax, which according to Joe Hockey will raise nearly $2 billion in 2016-17, certainly more money than is raised by the deficit levy. And there's going soft on multinational profit shifting, a painfully obtuse area of taxation, but one that's critically important as companies globalise. Around $1 billion of revenue has been lost, the government going soft on multinational profit shifting. As they say, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and soon you're talking real money. And on top of that has been some extra spending measures. There's parental leave, which is hidden in the contingency reserve, but then there's smaller decisions. For example, over the last 6 years, the non-concessional cap on super contributions has remained at $150,000. This year it was pushed up to $180,000. That's $40 billion of new spending going to people who are putting more than 150 grand a year into super. What sort of an income do you need to have to put more than 150 grand a year into the super? Well, say you're contributing 15%, I'd say that's $1 million income every year. An extraordinary set of priorities to put $40 million into super for the top end while you're shutting down legal aid centres. And that brings me to the second question. What does this do to the breach of faith with the Australian people? I think no politician in the history of Australian politics has been so unequivocal with the Australian people that they would keep their promises as Tony Abbott. If there has been one thing that Australians have known about Tony Abbott over the last few years, it's that he would stick to his pledges. He told us this innumerable times. We're wearing suits and fluoro jackets in every workplace in the country, every state and territory of the country. But the promises that have been broken are significant. Not just the no new taxes pledge, but the cuts to health and education. The NT Chief Minister says there'll be 1,200 hospital beds closed across the country, and not in 4 years' time, but in 43 days' time. The cuts start flowing from the July 1st of this year. The cuts to education you can see simply by looking at the education funding line, which flattens significantly. And the cuts to the ABC and to SBS are seen in the scrapping of the ramp-up program by ABC. All of this is, I think, particularly egregious in an environment in which Mr Abbott said that he would be different, that he wouldn't cut pensions, and that, in particular, you could judge him based on what he said before the election. I wish, of course, there were a coalition member to respond to me, but I suspect they've chosen not to come along today, either because they're basking in the reflected glory today of protesters, pollsters and premiers, or maybe because they just stopped for a cigar on the way. The third test that I think any budget has to meet is the fair go test. This matters particularly in Australia, in which inequality has been rising significantly, in which earnings for the top 10% have risen 3 times as fast as earnings for the bottom 10% since the mid-1970s, in which the top 1% share has doubled and the top 0.1% share has tripled. An Australia in which the richest 3 Australians have more wealth than the poorest 1 million Australians. In that environment, we have to ask ourselves, how have battlers made out compared to billionaires? And as Ben Phillips has outlined so astutely for you, so much of the pain in this budget falls on the bottom of the distribution. For the top, there's the parental leave scheme, there's the better tax deal for multinationals and for superannuants with multi-million-dollar balances. But at the bottom, there's the proposition that a 20-something who loses their job might not be able to get any unemployment assistance for 6 months, during which period I worry that they'll suffer homelessness and that mental illness could well be exacerbated. There's the mindless cuts to legal aid, to Indigenous programs, to so many of the supports that the vulnerable Australians rely on. So ultimately, what you have with this budget, I think, is not a budget which pays down debt faster, because it doesn't. It actually pays down debt a little slower. But you've got a budget that redistributes. The metaphor I like to think of when we think of budgets is that for most Australians, those who put together the budgets are a bit like the plumber. Apologies to my friends in Treasury when I say this. But, you know, most Australians don't notice the good work you do so long as things are flowing all right. But when it starts to back up, that's when people really look to see what's going on. And I think Australians are now looking at a system where things are starting to back up, where the government has decided that they can put aside $40 million for multimillionaires to get a better tax deal on their superannuation by taking that money away from pensioners and low-income families. This is a redistributive budget, but not in the sense we tend to use the word. It's a budget that is going to increase the gap between the haves and the have-nots, while keeping the return to surplus trajectory the same, even a little slower than it was before. I think it's the wrong set of priorities for Australia at any time, but particularly the wrong set of priorities in an Australia which has become so much more unequal over recent decades. It's a budget which I think needs to be carefully scrutinised, as this panel has today, and hopefully one that can be sent back to the drawing board to produce a better solution. Look, thanks very much, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And with John, we had the image of the patient, and with Andrew, the plumber. I sort of know, I think Ben at the beginning said it was scary being in the budget lockup. I'm sort of interested in what happens in there now with that imagery of the plumber and things going backwards in a sense. But of course, it also gets to the heart of what is the intent of the budget. And as I said at the beginning, this notion of it being representative of values and priorities within the community. And yet the response from the community as a whole seems to be, and certainly in the media as we're seeing it, has tended to be very concerned about a number of the inequalities, the trust issues, which a number of our speakers have reflected on. Michelle Grattan, of course, one of Australia's most influential political journalists and editor of The Conversation, is going to reflect on what's the political implications of this. Within just a series of a week, it seems as though the fortunes of the government have gone from a strength of we're going to fix this emergency to being widely criticised. What's going on, Michelle? How can we make sense of this? Thank you.
Well, as a political writer, I always think it's good to have economists around, but it's quite formidable to follow this bevy of them. However, we'll try. It will be a while, I think, before we know the long-term political impact of Tuesday's budget. But it is clear at this early stage that the government has put a lot of weight in its saddlebags early in its term. And I think this has come about basically for three reasons. Firstly, Tony Abbott took out far too much insurance before the elections with his promises that almost certainly he didn't need to make, not all of them. Secondly, the coalition exaggerated the budget crisis it faced, reducing its flexibility. And thirdly, ideology has been given too much rein in this budget. The Abbott promises were a constraint on framing the budget, and then they were a curse when some, or indeed many, were broken. They were so extensive that breaches were always going to be inevitable. The coalition had trapped itself. It played the short-term pre-election politics more than it had to, and then it's paid the price by sacrificing its longer-term credibility in office. how it ever thought it was going to get away with such extensive breaches after he had so effectively used the trust card against Julia Gillard is, I must say, something of a mystery. The government became victim, I think, of its own propaganda, its sense of economic and political righteousness. To use another description, its own hubris. It thought that it could do what Gillard did in trashing promises, in her case really a single promise, because it wasn't Labor. But one message from today's polls is that it becomes obvious that, at least in the immediate term, people are very willing to apply the same standards to both sides of politics. So they marked the Gillard government down for a breach of promise. They're marking the Abbott government down for its broken promises. If the government had not overhyped its description of the fiscal situation, a situation I think that was more of a difficult problem, certainly in the medium term, than a crisis, it would not have had to resort to such extreme measures. Some of what it's done in the budget on middle-class welfare, health and so on would have been much more acceptable if framed in more moderate terms. Yet there's been a contradiction in regard to its own insistence that the fiscal situation is so bad that such harsh measures are inescapable. For example, all the government revenue that's saved from the co-payment is going into the new medical research fund rather than going to the budget bottom line. And this is presumably to deal with the issue of the pre-election pledge that we won't cut health. But in fact, it represents a distortion, worthy as the medical research fund is in itself. And Joe Hockey's argument that investing in research now will in fact find cures and save the health scheme money later, I think is just an example of a total stretch in logic, because I don't think anyone thinks that however good Australian research is, it's going to find these massive breakthroughs in such a way that suddenly, or even over the long term, health costs are greatly reduced. It doesn't work like that. The government also set up criteria for judging the budget, which in fact have come back to bite it. For example, it talked much when there was a leak, in this case an unintended leak. Most of those leaks were very strategic and almost all given out to News Limited, but the one that appeared in News Limited about the high income levy, the first one, was in fact a genuine unintended leak. And when it was defending that proposed levy, it talked a lot about fairness. Ministers said, well, if you're going to have a budget where everyone does the heavy lifting, sounding like some bodybuilding contest, I must say, but anyway, that was the language they used, then you have to deal with the higher income earners, and the only way is to do that when it in fact goes to the tax side. But the trouble was, when the actual budget came out, it was quite clear that even with that tax hike, in fact, the budget, as has been mentioned before by the earlier speakers, is not fair. The lifting is indeed being done disproportionately by those further down the scale. So the government had set up the criteria, everyone looked at the fairness thing, and in fact in today's Nielsen poll, some 6 in 10 plus people condemn the budget as not fair, and this is far more than have found previous budgets over many years to be not fair. Ideology, as well as its own rhetoric, pushed this budget into overreach. Joe Hockey has become obsessed by the whole idea of ending the age of entitlement. And this budget does have the mark of Joe Hockey all over it. Hockey, incidentally, is obviously an aspiring leader for the future, and that came through very much, I think, in the speech he gave on Wednesday, the traditional post-budget speech, which often focuses very heavily on the data and the ins and outs of the budget, but in Hockey's case was very much about values. Now, again, it's a matter of degree. I think that most people these days would think that we do need to target measures more carefully to need, that some measures have become excessive, that you can't do things that maybe 20 years ago were able to be afforded. But this budget, for ideological reasons, I think has taken that far too far. Now, one might have thought that Tony Abbott would be a moderating force in these budget preparations. And he did chair the Expenditure Review Committee all through, which doesn't always happen in the preparation of a budget. Sometimes that chairing, in fact, goes to the Treasurer. But he wasn't that moderating force. And I think there's quite an interesting question to be raised as to why that was. Tony Abbott has had a number of positions on key policy areas over the years. Of course, we all remember the climate change weather vane comment, but also if you have a look at Battle Lines, his book, he has a quite different view on means testing than he does these days. But if we ask why he wasn't more of a moderating force, it does raise the question of whether he's become a real convert to the philosophy of ending the age of entitlement, or whether he judged that that's where the Liberal Party's centre of gravity now is, and he didn't think that it was prudent or possible to be more pragmatic in some areas. Abbott's personal authority and reputation, I think, has taken an enormous hit from this budget. And politically, that is one really important message out of what's happened. Just as Julia Gillard was effectively branded a liar, so that is now how Labor is now describing him. And in a sense, the government's not putting up much of a fight when that term is used. And I think this does have very important implications for both Abbott and for the government. The government has a big agenda coming up, an ambitious agenda with white papers on tax and on federalism and a productivity commission inquiry into industrial relations, and that's just some of the items. Now, these will produce substantial and controversial measures which the government will take, some of them at least, to the 2016 election. And it's hard to see how Abbott can convincingly carry what will be, in any circumstances, quite a difficult election campaign. His problem in trying to repair his credibility is partly that he's never had a huge basis of popularity. We're not talking here like of a Prime Minister like, for example, Bob Hawke, who started really popular, and therefore, even though he had setbacks at various times, he was able to repair and recover. Abbott is not naturally a politician who people are inclined to forgive. Now, I'm not seriously raising leadership speculation here, but I'd merely say that it would be an interesting situation if the coalition trailed Labor for a very long time. The government, I think, has several immediate problems. One is the states, and I can't see it doing much for them in in the wake of their complaints, but with 3 Liberal premiers facing election, the squeals are unlikely to stop, and that will be a big irritant for the government. The second problem is the Senate, with Labor, the Greens and Palmer threatening a raft of measures. Now, not all those threatened measures will be blocked. For example, I think the 2 tax rises, petrol and the income tax rise, should be all right because there won't be the required pairings to vote them down. On some measures, the government will undoubtedly have to compromise, and I think it will lose some others. The Medicare co-payment does seem, at this point anyway, to be at high risk, with Labor and the Greens and the Palmerites all being very critical. And the crackdown on the dole for young people also, I think, is really unlikely, you would think, and again you have to stress on present indications, to survive in its current form. Some measures will be dealt with by the old Senate and others will carry through into the new Senate, and that's a further complication. How the Palmer party will behave when it comes to the point is, I think, one of the big unknowns in the aftermath of this budget. Now, Clive Palmer has been going around with firecrackers and essentially causing merry hell with them. But nevertheless, you have to raise a question about how flexible he will be. For example, on one thing, some of the higher education changes, he started off saying no, and he seems to have come round, I think, after a chat with Christopher Pyne. So there really is no roadmap to be able to predict how he will act. Even before the polls of today, I thought that a double dissolution, the talk of a double dissolution at some point, because Tony Abbott wanted to get rid of the Palmerites and not be under their thumb, as Labor was seen to be under the Greens' thumb, that talk seemed to me pretty fanciful. Such a gamble with a public as fickle as people are nowadays would be an enormous risk for the government. But I think certainly after the poll that we've seen today, the polling generally, we can forget the double dissolution talk. The last thing the voters would want in the next year or so is another election. And as for dealing with the Palmer party, well, the Nielsen poll had PUP on 6%, and the quota for a double dissolution is 7.69%. So you can see that the getting rid of exercise could go really badly wrong. The message certainly from the budget overreach is be very careful of any election overreach. Now, let me end briefly with a note about Bill Shorten. Both Newspoll and Nielsen have him leading decisively as preferred Prime Minister. But Shorten obviously is in that position solely because of Tony Abbott, rather than because of himself. This budget has obviously been a gift to the opposition, and at the moment Shorten is doing very well out of it, just like Abbott before him did very well being Dr. No. But Shorten's challenge is whether he can translate this advantage into a more permanent rebuilding for Labor. He has a great opportunity, but the problem he also has, I think, is that people won't forget quickly their criticism of Labor over the previous years. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And that was great, and we can sort of, add imagery of bodybuilders as well to our plumbers and the others. But the notion of overreach was such a powerful theme that you were putting forward, and that notion, that idea of, to what extent, you can be authorised to push those edges and boundaries and still remain viable in terms of trying to make substantive change. one of the things that seems to have come through with all our speakers has been, as well as a focus on specific policies and some of the detail, is a discussion which is far more broad around this issue of trust